Hi, Kareth.
Hi, how are you? Hi, Mike. Hi, Lisa. Well, we're Texas hot today.
Y'all are much hotter than we are. I hope it's not destroying the grapes.
It is definitely a challenge hi everybody to be facing this kind of heat. But it's similar to 2017. We had heat, pretty significant heat at about the same point in the growing season. Although I think that this heat spell sort of is of longer duration than we might have experienced in 2017. So it definitely, move this to gallery. It definitely seems like we got a lot of heat on our hands. So, we'll manage it and, off to the races. Harvest is already here. Well, thank you everybody for joining me. And I'm sure more people will trickle in as we go. As always, I'll try to keep this to like 45 minutes because I think that's pretty much, all that people really want to sit and listen for. And I know Zoom has many negative connotations, even though it's a great way to bring everybody together. So if you haven't been to a Zoom session with me before, welcome. They were pretty regular, of course, back in 2020, but they continue to be a wonderful way for me to have an opportunity to connect with everybody, to share information with everybody when you can't be here with me at the winery. So welcome. What I usually do is I invite one or two people to say hello and tell me what you're drinking, if you're drinking anything, and it may just be water or a gin and tonic because it's really, really hot where you are. So let's see, I see, is that half of Ed down there and Carrie? Corner. Are you guys driving?
We're on our way home to drink, so I thought I wouldn't drink now because I'm driving. So
exactly. I would say, okay, so you guys are eliminated from the "what are you drinking" conversation.
That's disappointing, but thank you.
Unless it's bottled water. All right, Mike and Lisa, you guys have something open. Do you want to introduce yourself and say what you're drinking?
Yeah, Mike and Lisa Mayer of Houston. We're drinking a 2018 Bruliam Gaps Crown Vineyard Pinot Noir.
Nice.
And it's wonderful.
It is nice.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a bright, it's lovely. It's super perfect, lovely, lovely, joyful fruit. Okay, let's see. I see, is that, I think that's Laura down there in the corner. I haven't seen you since the event at Montage. How are you? Oh, you're on mute. Do you have a glass of wine with you, or do you want to just say hello and who you are?
I do. I'm Laura, and I have I was just trying to look up. It's the one with the real colorful label.
The Torrey Hill. You have Torrey Hill Pinot. Excellent. One more introduction. Does anyone else want to say hi and share what they're drinking? Some people have bad lighting. I can't see who everybody is. Anyone? Is that you, Denise? On a funny angle? Do you want to?
I just ran home from work, and hello, everybody from Dallas. And I haven't gotten a beverage yet, but I'm getting one ready now. Paul's heading to the wine fridge. So hello, everyone.
Awesome. Well, welcome here. We have like a heavy Texas contingency. We have everybody covered. We have like Austin, Dallas, Houston, and welcome everybody else from all over. So basically what I wanted to do was run through a little bit about Harvest 2022, because that's where we are in life as winemakers, run through what we have in the fall release, and talk about a few other topics. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I'll continue to bounce back and forth between seeing all of you Brady Bunch style and sharing my screen. So without further ado, here comes the harvest update. So I made this today, and if you get a thank you note from me in the days ahead, it's going to say Harvest 22. We should rebrand it as the Fast and the Furious, the Grape Edition, or Revenge of the Grape. Because, Harvest came up lickety split, as you read in the papers. It has been warm, and we were off to the races in generally probably 7 to 10 days earlier than last year. And last year was a pretty early year. I think this is due to a number of different factors. The first factor, of course, is there's a set number of days from when grapes set and when they turn color to the point that they're ready to be harvested. In general, it's a set amount of time, the phenology of the grape. So the earlier you have bud break, the earlier you have set, the earlier the grapes are going to be ready. And of course, that's a byproduct largely of degree days and soil temperature. The second factor I think that's at hand, of course, is the warm temperature. We've had a warm summer, and certainly these last few weeks have been warm indeed, pushing grapes into ripe territory. And I think the third really most salient factor is that we just had low set. There's just not that much fruit on the vine. And whether we're talking about Pinot, whether we're talking about Cab, everybody seems to have lower set. And that, I think, again, is a byproduct of the weather during bloom and fertilization. So at that point in time in the grape physiology, they are very, very sensitive to changes in temperature. So if it gets overcast, the grapes aren't going to set well and they're not going to fertilize well. We still are facing some drought. You know, the bulk of our rain also happened in October. We had a big rain after harvest, which was great, but then we didn't get that much rain in the spring. So in addition to that, cluster weights are a little bit down. So when you have a short crop and you have a small set and you have ample warm sunshine, everything is going to ripen a lot more quickly. So, and we will dive into those topics in a little bit more detail. So the fast and the furious, here we go. So again, as I had mentioned to you before, we have a light crop and an early crop. And here on one side, you can see a pretty cool picture of the frost igloo. And I'm sure that all of you have seen pictures online, on the internet, of the frost sprinklers that we put up in the vineyard. Of course, being in a drought, I wish there were easier and better ways that we could have frost protection. We actually have giant windmills in the big vineyard across the street from our house. And I think those benefit us by default. But of course, one of the most common ways that we can protect a bud is by using a frost sprinkler. And that idea is that you have to get the sprinklers going before the temperature drops. And you actually do want it to freeze over, because it's an exothermic heat generating reaction as the water goes from being liquid to frozen. So you need to have it already frozen and keep adding water and have it convert from liquid to frozen, which is exothermic. So that generates a little bit of heat, which then protects the bud. Again, I wish there were more eco-friendly ways to manage frost issues. And of course, with climate change, you know, frost is happening later and later into the season. We had some really cold days around Mother's Day, as I recall. And, you know, the vines just took a battering. So if the bud freezes, obviously it's not going to push a shoot and it's not going to grow, and you're not going to be able to generate a cluster there. So that will be really one of the first factors that caused the lower crop yield that we have this year, again, which has resulted in an earlier harvest. So it's kind of a cool picture. You see the little frost igloo, and next to it, you see a beautiful, resilient little bud that weathered the frost and went on to push a shoot. So again, this slide really reiterates a lot of the factors that I mentioned earlier in the Zoom today. We had an early bud break. And then during set, it was cold, it was overcast. We had some episodes of extreme cold, and hail. So, you know, we are lucky that we are not Burgundy. We don't get hail all that often, but this year we did suffer hail after bud break. Here at Torrey Hill, it was probably 5 minutes and it was done. But in other parts of the Russian River Valley, it was a lot more severe. And some of those vineyards suffered hail damage in a way that I've actually never seen before, other than in photos. And the hail can be so severe that it can damage the growing, tender, young green shoot, and the shoot can actually bruise, and it will damage the xylem and phloem within it, prevent the shoot from actively transporting water and sugar. The hail can shear the leaves. It looks like little bites and chunks are taken out of them. And, you know, if the shoot can continue to grow and push new leaves as it gets taller, it's less of a problem. But of course, early on in the evolution of each grape growing season, you know, you start with a bud and it pushes and the shoot starts to grow. And at that point, the grape can only rely on the stored non-structural carbohydrates from last season. It's not able to generate photosynthesis until it gets to 6 to 8 leaves. So if that hail happens at a time and damages leaves before the grapes are able to produce their own sugar via photosynthesis, it can also have an impact on the ability of the grape and the vine to set the fruit and grow the fruit. So we're also looking at lower cluster weights. And again, you can see a picture of a Pinot Noir cluster. They're really, really teeny, low cluster weights throughout all of the vineyards. So even if all of the crop sets and you have 2 clusters per shoot, those clusters themselves seem to be a lot smaller. Okay, so I went through all of the vineyards just to find you guys pictures of the worst and the worst, right? So this is a minority of what I'm seeing in the vineyard, but just for the sake of teaching, I had to put these pictures up. So on one side, we have bird and bee damage, and the other side, we have shot berries. So we can talk about the bird and bee damage to start with. So of course, like when the birds come down, they have their little beaks, the grapes taste delicious. They puncture the grapes and put those little holes in them. That causes the grapes, of course, to ooze out their totally delicious sweet nectar, which of course then attracts all of the bees. So then the bees come and they continue to chomp on the grapes. It's not good to the grapes. It opens the grapes up, of course, for all kinds of different microbial infections that can cause spoilage organisms coming into the winery that we don't necessarily want. Obviously, we don't want half-eaten grapes or exposed or oxidized parts of grapes going into our wine. So, you know, in the vineyard, for the most part, those grapes are just dropped or ignored and not picked. But it is sort of shocking, striking to see when you go out into the vineyard to sample and suddenly there's this like whole glom of bees sticking on one cluster, buzzing around, eating everything. And then the other picture is just quite a remarkable picture of shot berries, which are these little green berries. The lighting is not ideal, but basically what you see is a skeleton, right? It looks like a skeleton of these little tiny green berries that are dangling off the main rachis. And you can see a few purple berries alongside it. And those berries are big enough that you can imagine that that entire cluster should be formed of grapes and not those little tiny shot berries, those little tiny skeletons of grapes that never develop. And that is due to failure to fertilize during fruit set. And if the pollen from the anther can't reach the seed, the female part in the pistil, I think, in the ovule, then it's not going to fertilize. It's not going to form a seed and it's not going to form fruit. And what you end up is with are these little tiny hard green spheres. And they'll just fall out on the shaker table, but it's just disappointing, right? Because it's just another way that yield is compromised. So again, these pictures of like the bees chomping on these like desiccated open berries and this shot right here of my rock piles in Zinfandel really are the worst, but I always think it's instructive to show you photos of what's happening in the vineyard, especially during harvest season where we are right now. So of course I had to follow that up with some glamour shots. So again, to just prove to you that those pictures that you saw before really are the worst of the worst. And you can see at Torrey Hill, we have our bird nets up, protecting the fruit. This fruit is obviously further along in ripening because you can see here a few little dimpled berries and the clusters look a lot looser, which happens as the fruit ripens. In contrast, here at San Giacomo, this photo was a couple weeks ago. This is probably like 20 bricks, maybe 10 days ago. And you can see these clusters still look very, very tight. And you can see the set is great. These clusters look like, you know, beauty queen clusters. So again, I showed you the worst of the worst and the best of the best. So the take-home message for Harvest 22, early and light. Sauvignon Blanc continues to be a hot commodity. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any from John Bucher for a late harvest project, but all hope's not lost. I'm still asking around to see if I can do a fun little project. Everybody is light. You know, what we hear around the winery from my winemaking colleagues, I was supposed to get 5 tons. I got 1.8. I was supposed to get 3.5 tons. I got 1.5. So everybody's down and the growers are down at least 20%. So what is the good news and the bad news about harvest 2022? Well, the good news is that the fruit, other than the picture that I showed you with the bees and the bird damage, the fruit looks very, very healthy. It is a low disease pressure year because overall it's been dry and it's been warm. So mildew pressure seems to be very, very low. So that's positive. Vine mealybugs are really the only critters that we've really been worrying about. And that's only because they're vectors for virus, but not that they destroy grapes in and of themselves. Of course, we know with low yield comes high quality. It's more of a bummer if you're a grape grower and you get paid based on tonnage. But for us wine growers, we're always happy to have smaller clusters, concentrated colors. We know much better how to manage water in a drought year. You know, last year in the vineyard, it was really challenging for us up here in Sonoma County because we are so accustomed and blessed with having water in the winter. We're used to having rain November, December, January, February, so we don't think about turning on our irrigation and having an exogenous supply of water, especially during fruit set. We learned last year that it is, you know, of course, water is a resource. And if you have your checkbook out, you want to spend the balance in the early part of the growing season. And I think we all had sprinklers on earlier this year to preserve the crop that we had. So that was a good learning experience of everyone putting their brains together. You would think I would know better because I've been getting fruit from Central Coast and Santa Lucia Highlands for, I don't know, 12, 14 years, and they do not get the rain we do. They are used to irrigating early in the year, and I should have taken a clue from them, but now we all know better up here in Sonoma. We continue to have issues with labor shortage, as you can guess, supply chain, as you can guess, which I think affects not just the wine industry, but everybody's industry. So I think that's really the wrap up that I have on Harvest 22. And before we jump into the release wines, does anybody have any harvest related questions? Everybody good? I threw a lot of information at you at once. Everyone good with Harvest 22? All right, on we go to the fall release wines. Okay, so let's start with the Sobranos Vineyard Pinot Noir. So this is just sort of a recap of the growing season. It was an average rain year, which for the Santa Lucia Highlands, an average rain year is significantly less rain than we see in Sonoma County. It's drier, but foggier. It's also cooler. 2019 was a year with a later bloom. It was a cool summer that warmed up late into the summer. It really didn't get warm until the latter part of September, and we had a really, really long growing season. Oh, and this was a fun little slide. So in 2019, I harvested the fruit on, you can see September 26, 2019, at a Brix of 25.4. And then my very first ever crop of Sobranos was in the year 2010, you know, pretty close within a week of that harvest date at the exact same Brix. So I put that in there for fun and for historical context. And just that it's been really fun to watch this vineyard evolve in terms of complexity and nuance and sense of place. And I'm very happy to get nice scores. It doesn't always happen, but it's very nice when it happens. So there you go. Consistency is next to godliness. 92s from everybody. And I'll take that. So it seems prescient that we always hold back the Sobranos because it gives us more wine to offer in this release period. Of the 3 Pinots in this current fall release, the 2019 Sobranos definitely has the most gravitas of the 3. It is definitely a serious brooding wine, as it always is. So that is definitely true to form. The long growing season that we were lucky enough to have in 2019 is also really distinctly sense of place, and the fact that Santa Lucia Highlands generally is a cooler site with all that morning fog and that intense afternoon wind. But you know, it never hits the same peak temperatures down there as it does here. Even here, where we're hitting, you know, parts of Santa Rosa and Sonoma County are busting 110 degrees today. Down in Santa Lucia Highlands and Gonzales, it's still probably 10 degrees cooler than that. So that's really a hallmark of the region and the vintage. So we can get questions on Sobranos. It smells delicious. I opened up a bottle the other day for an Instagram photo shot. It
Well,
smells great. It tastes great.
Congratulations on it.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's beautiful fruit, and I'm very, very lucky that I have the opportunity to get fruit from Mark Pizzoni, who's really the most fastidious and detail-oriented farmer I know. And I say farmer in addition to being a wine grower, because his family still has row crops. They still grow artichoke, they still grow lettuce, and asparagus, among other things. So the Santa Lucia Highlands really is a place where agriculture is center and of the heart of what people are doing. And I think obviously that degree of dedication and being so detail oriented in the vineyard really pays off in the beautiful fruit that we get at the winery and the wines that we can make, which is really fun. So that was the 2019. So of course the other two Pinots are from 2020. So 2020. So as you know, it was a rough year for us up in Sonoma County, and it was a rough year for wine growers and winemakers all around California. You know, for the most part, Pinot Noir has largely been shielded from smoke impact and wildfire events because we are an early ripening grape. So it's not atypical for me to be picking Torrey Hill in August. In fact, this year we picked on August 23rd. So we, again, have been shielded from fires that are happening in October. Unfortunately, as you know, in 2020, we had the lightning complex fires in August, and that affected everybody, and it really affected which vineyards I picked and the winemaking choices that I made in the winery. So, you know, we'll talk about that and why I made those choices and how those choices impacted the wine in the glass. So of course, here is the 2020, yep, there we go, Torrey Hill Vineyard Pinot Noir. And from my perspective here, I don't know how the light is, it is slightly lighter in hue. You can see through it, not super well, but a little bit more than in years past. That said, I had a couple from Oregon in the tasting room yesterday who are Willamette fans, and I poured them the gaps and they're like, wow, you know, up in Oregon, you can like see right through these things. This is a California wine. I'm like, well, our wines taste like sunshine, snap. But that said, the 2020 Torrey Hill is a lighter bodied iteration of the Russian River Valley. It is very, very pretty. It's very delicate. It's got floral hints, and it's definitely leaning more into the strawberry category than the black cherry category. And a lot of the things that I did in the winery were done with an abundance of caution and looking ahead to where consumers and critics were going to put the 2020 vintage sort of broadly in the cultural context of wine. And we'll go into these things in detail, but some of the things that I thought about and did were fermenting at a lower fermentation temperature to limit extraction. I didn't use any new oak. So we can talk a little bit about smoke impact because I know everybody likes to talk about smoke impact and learn about it. But you know, smoke impact encompasses a whole group of biochemical compounds called volatile phenols. And volatile phenols are everywhere in the winery. There are volatile phenols in new toasted barrels, right? So you think about a wildfire and forests burning. Well, that's a lot of the same process that you're getting in the inside of a toasted oak barrel, obviously, right? It's a breakdown of the wood ligand, and that process releases volatile phenols. And we know that new oak barrels and new French oak is delicious, and it's sexy, and it can give you bass notes and soprano notes and sweetness and savory notes. Like, we love new oak. New oak is delicious. But some of the exact same chemical compounds that are analyzed from new oak can be present in smoke taint. So I thought, well, gosh, why would we sort of muddy the pictures in a year that's already going to be fraught with preconceived notions? So no new oak, just once used in neutral oak. And to be honest, once used oak happens to be my favorite kind of oak. So I'm not unhappy with that. But some of the advantages of having new oak are that it can increase the body of a wine, because new oak has a higher level of wood tannins, and those integrate with the grape tannins and build a matrix that creates your mouthfeel and your texture. So adding a higher percentage of new oak is a trick that winemakers can use to build texture and to move a wine from, say, lighter bodied to medium bodied, or medium bodied to fuller bodied. So that is one reason, among others, why the 2020 Torrey Hill is a lighter bodied iteration of the Russian River Valley. I also picked it a little bit on the earlier side for Torrey Hill. It tends to be a fruit forward charmer. And I usually pick it, high 24s, even into 25 bricks. This one, I picked it a slightly lower bricks. I just really wanted to get it off of the vine and into the winery out of an abundance of caution. So we can go back to that share screen. Hopefully you can still see me, because my fancy ring light just turned off here. So again, this just reiterates that I only used once used oak. I dumped the press fractions. I didn't use any of the press fractions this year, so our yields are lower. Slightly lower bricks, although the acid was consistent with phenolic ripeness. And again, making this wine with an overabundance of caution. So 2020 was such a striking year in so many ways. It looms so big in our cultural context that I asked Amelia to create a label that really reflected what 2020 meant to her. And being a teenager who did homeschool, I think that her label perfectly reflects her experience, which was, very much COVID related. So I have to say, I think this cheeky label is among my favorite to date. And I think my favorite detail is the fact that the sun, instead of having rays, has little coronaviruses going around the outside. So I know there are people out there who buy this wine just for the label. And indeed, it doesn't disappoint. It's super adorable and speaks to place and speaks to time, as I think small production wines should. So this, because I made a fancy background, is hard to see the curve, but this is the fermentation curve for Torrey Hill. And you can see this curve happens to be the temperature curve. And this is, it came in, soaked up to about 25 bricks, goes through the exponential phase, goes through a stationary phase, and then the yeast die out. This is a beautiful UC Davis fermentation curve, but I just put this up to show you the peak temperature, which happens to be 77.8, which is significantly lower than I typically ferment. And there have been a number of really good studies that show that extracting color, anthocyanins, and especially extracting tannins and building matrix is directly dependent on fermentation temperatures. So when you're fermenting, 83 to 90, independent of how many punch downs you do a day, or how many pump overs you do a day, or the number of movements that you do a day to increase extraction and mix up the tank, then one of the number one predictors of extraction happens to be fermentation temperature. So on one hand, having a hotter, warmer fermentation temperature is great, because you're extracting more tannin, more flavor out of the grape. That said, on the other hand, at higher fermentation temperatures, you do sometimes lose some of the really pretty aldehydes that you get at a lower fermentation temperature, and some of those fermentation esters, especially, that you get at a lower fermentation temperature. So every winemaking decision, of course, is like a yin and a yang. What am I going to do? What is more important to me? So for 2020, I really wanted to make sure that there was nothing in the wine that it all made the consumers think I was trying to take compromised grapes and pull one over on you, because the reality is I only made 2 Pinots, and I typically make 4. And I went back sourcing from Anderson Valley to look for additional fruit that I could use when I lost all the other vineyards that I was unable to vinify that season. So those really are the decisions around specific to the Torrey Hill, which again smells really pretty. It's just gonna keep evolving. It's lovely. It's a charmer. It's like so true to form, so easy to drink. Okay, because I know you want to talk about it, so we can talk about smoke taint for a little bit. And of course, I just listed those adjectives that people have: smoky, burnt, campfire, medicinal, earthy. But it's really that retronasal ashtray component that is unique to smoke impact. And again, I mentioned in here that the sensory impact of smoke impact does indeed overlap with barrel toast, some kinds of bacterial spoilage, with Brettanomyces, which is another spoilage organism. Of course, the wood degrades in a fire. The thermal degradation of the ligands releases volatile phenols. You know, at this point, there are 7 free volatile phenols that we measure and look for. There are 5 that are bound. Of course, there are many, many other volatile phenols that exist when ligands burn. These just happen to be the ones that were first identified by the AWRI, the Australian Wine Research Institute, that have become proxy markers for us, in particularly guaiacol and methyl guaiacol, and guaiacol especially appears to be a good proxy as a measurement for smoke taint. So it's a particular volatile phenol compound. We're able to measure that with mass spectrometry, gas chromatography, and it does appear from a number of studies that if you have smoke impact, then the grapes seem to have an elevated level of guaiacol. It also seems to be true that grapes that are fermented that have an elevated level of guaiacol have an elevated level of guaiacol in the wine, and it appears that that guaiacol in the wine also correlates with the sensory perception of smoke impact, especially that retronasal char. So again, we have a number of compounds. The ability to test for the bound compounds is relatively new within the last year or so, being able to have standardized markers for those. So the volatile phenols enter the grape skins, and the grapes don't like it. It's itchy, scratchy. It's not good. It's a contaminant. So immediately they bind those up to a number of different complex sugars, different arabinoses. It's not just a straight up glucose or fructose. So you can imagine, as this volatile phenol attaches to any number of complex carbohydrate skeletons, it can become really challenging to monitor that in the lab. But we now have some nice standards that we can work with. And again, I talk about the fact that guaiacol is already present in grapes. Even if there's no smoke impact, grapes have guaiacol inside of them, especially Syrah. Actually, measuring guaiacol in Syrah and trying to look for smoke impact is actually totally useless because it has such a high intrinsic level of guaiacol. And also just to point out that any oak contact is going to change the amount of volatile phenols in the wine, and that there's a ratio between the phenols that are bound and that the phenols that are free. This is a slide from Dr. Ann Oberheister at UC Davis, and it's just showing you the parts of the grape and just the fact that I told you before, the volatile phenols quickly enter through the skins where they're immediately glycosylated in the pulp of the grape. And so this is a slide that we maybe looked at in 2020 when we were talking about smoke impact. And again, this is just sort of a graphic that I made. The smoke's absorbed through the skins. The grapes protect themselves by binding it to a complex sugar and packaging it away in a vacuole, like, oh, I'll deal with it later. Kind of like my teenagers, when I ask them to clean the room, they take all their dirty clothes, put it in the closet, I'll deal with it later. Same thing with a grape. When those compounds are bound to those complex sugars, to those arabinoses, we can't taste them, we can't smell them, which is why we call them bound or non-volatile. They're also significantly harder to remove if you're trying to ameliorate smoke impacted wine. The earlier in the ripening arc, the higher the percentage of bound compounds. So over time, they enter an equilibrium, and some of those bound compounds are released as free. This is another slide that I stole from Anne, but it just shows you how quickly the volatile phenols are released and absorbed into the juice. So it happens very, very quickly. So as soon as that wine goes into the tank, those with red wine making, right? So as soon as those grapes go into the tank, those volatile phenols leach out of the grape and into the surrounding juice. It happens fast.
Hey, Kareth.
Yeah, let me take
I
away
wish
my.
that you would have been my high school science teacher, because you make it sound really interesting. And you have so much knowledge on something that I hope you don't really ever have to use again, the smoke tank. But it seems like you have you guys have got a good handle on it. And I admire y'all's ability to stay at it, given every time you look up, it's like somebody hits you in the head, it seems like.
It feels that way. And, for all the information that we have, there's still so much that we don't know. So it definitely seems like scaling a glacier, but definitely more brains are better than fewer brains. And I think, unfortunately, climate change is a reality that we all have to face. And, the more we can know about managing crop during drought, the more we can know about when we should apply the water that we have, the more we can know about, impacts of late frost, how to protect our vines, what can we do if there's a wildfire, what are best practices, the better we're going to be. I mean, I wish we could bury our head in the sand and not ever have to think about smoke impact. But I thought it was a salient topic, right? Because 2020s are starting to be released into the market. So everybody is asking about it. So I thought we would spend a little time talking about it today. This is unpublished data from Jackson Family Wines, and you can't really see it because it's a bar graph and it's pretty small. But the point of the graph was that, Jackson Family Wines is huge, right? So in a non-smoke year, they tested guaiacol and methyl guaiacol on Pinot Noir from a bunch of different vineyards within their umbrella, including vineyards in Oregon, the Russian River Valley, Sonoma Coast, and all of those wines had a baseline level of guaiacol and methyl guaiacol in them. Guaiacol higher than methyl guaiacol. Pinot Noir as a variety doesn't seem to show methyl guaiacol as much. Petit Verdot, on the other hand, as a grape variety, seems to show it a heck of a lot. So there's a lot of varietal impact with smoke. But I just wanted to show that graph so you could see that, people talking about the 2020 vintage in publications, online, on social media, people who are knowledgeable about it, people who think they're knowledgeable but are not, may throw out this information at you. And you should know that just because someone says, oh, there was this chemical compound in the wine, it does not necessarily mean that there's smoke impact. These compounds can also come from, again, barrels, and they're intrinsic to the grape. So that's really why I popped this slide up here, and you can see Russian River Valley, Oregon, Anderson Valley, Central Coast. So a whole bunch of places, Santa Maria, where they were measuring this data in a non-smoke impact year. And I was loath to even put this slide up here. This comes from the AWRI, and it just talks about what is the threshold of perception. And we know whether we're talking about eating a papaya or putting wasabi on your sushi, everybody has a different threshold of perception to whether we're talking about cilantro or pepper or spicy Thai food, right? So there's people who don't taste smoke impact at all. There are people who are incredibly sensitive to smoke impact. So it's really dependent on the person as well as the matrix of the wine. So if you've got a great big heavy tannic Cabernet and it's got some residual sugar in it, and it's fruit forward. Those are things that can mask the impact of smoke taint. On the other hand, if you have a very delicate, easy to see through, lighter bodied Pinot Noir, of course, there's less matrix. So the smoke impact is going to stick out like a sore thumb. But there are standardized thresholds. These come from the Australian Wine Research Institute that we can talk about when in a study on a bell curve, most people can start to sense that there is something wrong with the wine. And of course, some of these studies are done with water versus wine, right? So there's a lot of factors to consider. And again, like I said, it's tricky, right? So tasters, some people can't taste smoke impact, some people can. We battle the ratio between the free and the bound volatile phenols because of course it lives in a buffer, as do most things in wine, being pH dependent. You look at the levels of compounds in a grape versus the levels of compound in a wine. Of course, those are different. And just because the air is smoggy from smoke doesn't mean that it's got the kind of fresh volatile phenols that are even going to affect grapes at all. We know that fresh smoke is much more impactful than old smoke that's been pushed up here from a fire that was, 200 miles south of us. That's 4 days old. So really the take home message from all of this is because there are so many factors at play, I approached the 2020 vintage with great caution and trepidation. So sadly, there were a number of vineyards that I decided in collaboration with my wine growers to not vinify. That said, the Anderson Valley, it was such a treat to be up in Mendocino again after a long hiatus. And I think the 2020 Torrey Hill has loads of charm, as it does every single year. And I think that slide was the final slide, and we're just at the 45-minute mark. In conclusion, I only have 2 Pinot Noirs, and this shows blue skies at Torrey Hill on August 22nd when I snapped a picture, and then harvesting on the 27th. Oh, right, and I went back to Anderson Valley up in Mendocino, a place that I love, and that was the final screen. So at this point, we have a couple minutes, and I'm happy to field questions and comments, whether it's about Harvest 22, 2022 current harvest, whether it's about past harvests or any of the wines in the fall release. Questions? I know in these sessions, I give you guys so much information in such a short amount of time.
Tell us about the Anderson Valley.
Oh man, I love Anderson Valley because it has such this glorious purity of red fruit. And I made Pinot from Anderson Valley in 08, 09, 10, 11. And it's one of those places where when like the temperature and the weather lines up perfectly, it's like the most glorious fruit in the world. When it doesn't, it will just break your heart. And they're further north than we are. The smoke impacted them differently. The weather up there was different, and they definitely had fires in Mendocino, actually into mid-September. So after we'd already taken our fruit up in Anderson Valley. And the cool thing was we got so lucky. So we went up there to harvest, and it was like freezing cold. It was so cold. I remember sitting in the cab of my dad's truck, like literally shivering, like freezing. And we knew a big heat wave like today was coming. And so we loaded up my dad's truck and we drove it down back into Sonoma County. And we got, down to the basin, and we're starting to drive back into Sonoma. And as we're going, like, it's starting to heat up, it's starting to heat up, it's starting to heat up. And the fruit got to the winery and it was so cold. And, not 2-3 hours later, it was already roasting outside. So I feel like, I just got really lucky. It was fun to be up in Mendocino again. Generally higher acidity fruit. Again, I didn't use any new oak, just really trying to let the purity of the AVA shine through. Bing cherry, cranberry compote, cranberry pie studded with cloves. It's got a lovely spiciness and just really on the bright red fruit side. Very, very pretty, a really feminine wine.
Sounds really good.
Yeah, it's super yummy. It's fun. Other questions, guys?
I have a non-harvest question for you.
Sure.
Are you doing the Palm Springs event again this year?
I am not, because it is my nephew Max's bar mitzvah. It's like that it's the end of January, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
last week in January.
It's the last week in January, and that's been on my calendar for 3 years, my little nephew Max in Los Angeles. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to participate in this year, but I said, well, in 2023, next year. But I said, keep me on the list. You know, bar mitzvahs only happen once, and I only have one nephew in Los Angeles.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Other questions? All right, guys. Thank you for your patience. I try to be timely and keep these at 45 minutes on the dot with plenty of action-packed information. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your time. Happy harvest post Labor Day. Kids off to college and everything in between. It's been a whirlwind, and I look forward to getting more fruit next week.
Cheers.
Yay,
Cheers.
All right,
cheers.
guys.
Thank you.
Cheers. Good night. Bye-bye, everybody. Be
Thank
well
you.
and be safe. Bye, everybody.
Yep.